This video is going to cover how to begin a console app in C++ in Visual Studio. So the first thing you would do if you don't have it loaded is to search for Visual Studio 2017, and we are using this second version on your machines. I have mine loaded. In order to create a project in Visual Studio, you'll do File, New Project. And there are several options. We are going to choose the option with Other and an empty project. You will always want to name your project something descriptive and usually something with your last name for when you need to submit things. So I'm going to just call this O'Loughlin Hello World, and we are going to create an empty project. You do want to pay attention to where that was saved so you can go back later and find the files. So every time you create a project, I will just show that again, File, New Project. You want to pay attention to where it's placing it. My computer is setting up to actually drop it in what's called the repos folder. If we want to change that, I would browse. And I would recommend that you create a folder for your projects for whatever semester and year that you are working in and wherever you want to place them. So for example, if I just went to Documents and I have a programming folder set up for C++, then you could save all your projects in this particular folder or whatever folder you want to use. So I'm going to do Spring 2019. And that way you know where all your information is stored. Now, typically Visual Studio will create, and I'm going to name this one Hello World 2. So I have a version 1 and version 2, but now it's in a different directory. Generally, when you're actually working with Visual Studio, if we take a look at my documents, it will store all of your projects in a folder underneath Visual Studio, and it will store them in this projects folder, and that's actually the most common default directory for them, but just my computer is setting up to send them somewhere else by my district. So that gets you started on setting them up a project and knowing where the folder is going to be located. That's going to be important later. To actually create a new project, we go over here to Source Files and we right click and we add a new item. When you add a new item, we want to add a .cpp file. This file should be named descriptively and it should indicate what the project does. This is Hello World. I am naming it with camel casing. For instances for turning things in, you could also name it with your last name, depending on what your instructor will recommend that you do. Now this creates, and I get this security warning also, you may or may not get that. This creates just a empty project. If I open it up, there is nothing there. And so our very first Hello World program, we include the #include directives IOStream in order to use cin and cout. We are going to be using the namespace standard, so we include that. And then every C++ program begins with int main, beginning brace, ending brace, and to output we use a cout statement. Whatever I want to output is in this case a string, and so I put that inside quotes. And then we often want to include an ENDL, which is an end line, and what that does, it just basically does a return, and that's ENDL, not the number 1. Okay, and it does a return at the end of the line. Now, all C++ programs should return. Because I have a return type here of int, I need to return an integer, so I'm going to return 0. And then depending on what you want to do and how you want to run your code, if you want to go to debug and just say start debugging, and it runs, it should load the console window and print Hello World, and then hit and enter, which we won't probably see. But when we do this, depending on which way you choose to compile your program, you might see it flash on the screen and disappear, just like that. So sometimes you just want to put in a, this is a Windows command, system pause, and that way you'll be able to see your code come up on the screen. And it will stay there. And then you get this press any key to continue, and when you do that, it closes the window. Another way to get the screen to pause is to use a C++ command called cin.get, and what that does is cin is for input, cout is for output, so cin is for input, and it actually just pauses the screen and it waits for user input. So it's waiting for user input. It's actually an input line to get input from the user, but we're basically using it as a pause command. And so if you don't want to use any Windows commands, you can see that it's waiting for me to pause or to do something. When I press enter, it then closes the window. So both of those solutions will work for holding the console window open when you guys are working on debugging your code.